There we go.
All right, we're good?
We're good.
All right, hi everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Nicole Mifsud, and I'm here to get our webinar started. You have 4 hosts today, myself, Erin Dennis, Lori Fernandez, and Patrick Greeley. We are all graduate students at Michigan State University in the MAET program. I am currently a 4th grade teacher in the Plymouth-Canton School District, and I will be serving as one of your hosts for today. Erin, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us what your role is today.
Hi everybody, my name is Erin Dennis, and for the last 13 years I've worked as the elementary librarian in Village Elementary at Heartland Schools. I will be serving as the moderator today. Lori?
All right.
Hi, I'm Lori Fernandez. I currently teach at Kent Career Technical Center. I teach computer programming. And I will be watching your tweets. If you have any questions, make sure that you tweet it to MAET Bridge. And Pat.
All right, and Patrick?
And I am Patrick Greeley. I'm a math teacher in Kalamazoo Public Schools in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I teach at Loy Norrix High School. I'll be operating the camera, and hopefully I do an okay job, and that the person who's speaking is the one that shows up on screen. If not, I'll get them there. And with that, I'll throw it back to you, Erin.
Actually, we're going to go to Nicole first.
Okay, we'll go to Nicole then. And Nicole's
All
over here.
right. Good? All right, well, we have a really great discussion planned for everybody today on gamification in the classroom. Have you ever noticed how hard it can be to pull kids away from a video game? What if we could engage kids on this level in our classrooms? Researchers have been exploring ways to do this through an idea called gamification. Gamification is the process of teaching content, incorporating game elements such as scoring, competition, and rules of play. Considering recent rapid changes in technology, the use of technology to gamify our classrooms is a possibility that could have a huge impact on education. Adding elements of gamification may lead to higher levels of engagement and collaboration, which may in turn lead to higher achievement. So we're glad you could join us as we discuss these and other potential uses, strengths, and limitations of gamification in the classroom. All right, before we get started, I would like to let you know that we really encourage your participation throughout this presentation. If you have a comment or question at any time during our discussion, feel free to tweet it using the hashtag MAETBridge, or you can add to the comment section directly under the live stream on YouTube. All right, and now for our first, I would like to introduce Liz Boltz. Prior to pursuing doctoral study, Liz developed and maintained a complex system of web-based applications for a private university in Ohio. In this role, she became increasingly interested in studying the structure, design, and content of educational technologies, particularly video games for learning. She has completed a Serious Games Certificate program at Michigan State, teaches with the MAET program, and is engaged in research on the use of video games to promote historical empathy. Second, I would like to introduce Spencer Greenhalgh. Spencer is a PhD candidate in the Educational Psychology and Educational Technology program at Michigan State University. His research focuses on how new digital spaces are changing both education and educational research. These spaces afford not only new kinds of learning, but also new ways of studying that learning. For example, just as Twitter's social networking features are allowing teachers to interact with each other through new, informal ways of professional learning, the digital nature of these interactions allows researchers to easily collect their content and other data that can be analyzed to better understand the learning taking place. In addition to work like this on teacher learning through social media, he has examined how player-generated data can lend insights into educational games and what teachers' digital portfolios reveal about their technological knowledge. And next, I would like to introduce Carrie Heeter. Carrie is a professor in the Department of Media and Information at Michigan State University, where she designs and studies cyber meditation and teaches foundations of serious games and human-centered experience design courses. She lives in San Francisco using a wide range of technologies to telerelate, teach, and collaborate with colleagues and students in Michigan and around the world. So thank you, Liz, Carrie, and Spencer for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Our pleasure.
And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand things off to Erin.
Thank you so much, Nicole. So today's topic is that we are going to be providing an introduction to gamification in the classroom, and it would probably be best to start with a definition of what gamification is. And in our research, we've learned that there is a little bit of a discrepancy regarding what gamification might be. So we thought it would be interesting to start out with your definition of gamification. How would you define it? Spencer, let's start with you on this question.
All right. Well, as Nicole said when she was introducing the webinar, I think gamification can be thought of broadly as using game elements, bringing that into the classroom. I think there are a lot of other ways that we can think about the relationship between games and education, though. So there are people who, so for example, I'm interested in how teachers might use games in a way similar to how they might use books or movies. And I think that's kind of interesting. So I'm going to answer partly by way of analogy. I'll try not to go on too long. But my background is in French teaching, and I'm currently studying educational technology. So I've done a little bit of reading in a field called computer-assisted language learning. And there's one really interesting article in that field that says, why do we call it computer-assisted language learning? Did we used to call it book-assisted language learning? No, we just called it language learning because the tool really isn't as interesting as what we're trying to do with it. And so I guess the point that I'm getting at here is I'm less concerned with a specific definition than with something that we're trying to accomplish in the classroom and a tool that can let us do that. And I think games are a fantastic tool to accomplish a variety of different objectives in the classroom.
Thank you. Carrie, can I go over to you?
Sure. And I will share my screen for a moment. So there are many different definitions, as you said, and like Spencer, I'm pretty broad in how I view it. So I just think it's intended to engage users and motivate them to behave in particular ways. And so that's about as broad as you can get, I guess. But James G says games are gamified, right? So it doesn't have to be inside of a game or outside of a game. It's just things that you do in a design way to get people motivated and engaged and try to affect their behavior.
Liz, I know that your background is a little bit different in that you work with game-based learning. Can you tell us a little bit about gamification in your eyes, and then maybe tell us a little bit about the difference between gamification and game-based learning?
Sure. So I completely agree with Spencer and Carrie's definitions. To focus it a little bit, just because we're kind of looking at this through the lens of education, one way to look at it would be, and then this is certainly not the end-all be-all of gamification, but one way to look at it that seems to be kind of a common view would be the layering or embedding of game elements on a course structure or aspects of learning. I believe it derives from economics. It's just kind of a way of applying game-related principles to other tasks in life. Tends to appeal to people's competitive instincts in a lot of ways. It doesn't have to be digital. I think that's important to point out, that gamification is not always, sometimes we tend to think of video games first. That's not necessarily the case. And I've also heard some people tend to prefer the term gameful. I think that's Jane McGonigal's term to refer to this. There's just a little bit of baggage, I think, with the term gamification. So it's just one thing to note. But in terms of what I tend to study, game-based learning or learning with games, real broadly, it's the ways in which games, whether they're in informal or formal learning settings, can promote learning. And learning conceptualized pretty broadly, so it could be habits of mind, particular content, skills, etc. So,
thank you very much. Narrowing down a little bit from this.
Looking at on Liz's mention of Jane McGonigal.
Mm.
So Jane says that gamification should evoke positive emotions like curiosity, love, joy, creativity, wonder, excitement, contentedness. And so it should bring out the best in us. So she's got a very rosy view of it.
So my going out and playing Pokemon Go is definitely doing all of those things.
Joyful.
Very joyful.
Well, and I think that, there's a really good point there, because it's easy to, and they might be using it in ways that we might not consider joyful because they're trying to push us in certain directions. And so it's, in some ways, it's really a business marketing technique, and I don't fault anyone for that. But when we bring it into our classrooms, especially when we're using this more classic understanding of gamification, we want to make sure that we're using it to empower students and bring out these positive emotions that Carrie and Jane talk about, rather than just try and, I don't know, put a new spin on gold stars and putting people in the corner, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Very good point. So can we take this and narrow it down a little bit and give our viewers some specific examples of ways that you might add some gamified elements to your classroom within your daily instruction, so that we have a little more of a concrete way to work with this topic? Anybody want to go first?
I wouldn't mind jumping right in. And the reason for this is I had a different example in my head, but recently, so I did all of my K-12 teaching in Utah, where I no longer live, but my brother lives there, and he actually ran into one of my former students the other day, and that was just fun. So I was his French teacher. I was actually also his debate teacher, and in both classes I was able to bring in some game elements to reinforce what we were trying to study in that class. And in the French class, one thing that I was trying to do is to turn our curriculum, the French 1 units that we were going through, into a sort of game, where every quiz in the unit was a particular adventure, a particular part of an adventure that they were going on. I think I was having them pretend they were spies trying to infiltrate France or something like that. But anyway, each quiz was couched in the language of the scenarios, the sort of thing, I wasn't giving out badges necessarily, I wasn't giving out points instead of grades, but there was an adventure that we were going on. And the feel that I was trying to establish in the classroom, and I'm not sure how well I succeeded, you'd have to ask my students, was the idea that we were engaged in some sort of an adventure, the sort of adventure that they might experience if they were at home playing a game, instead of just going unit by unit through a French 1 classroom.
What did that look like on a day-to-day basis in your classroom, though? Was this something that you were just talking through?
Well, so this was really my first time bringing gamification into the classroom, and I'm not even sure I thought about it in those terms when I was doing it, but looking back, I could definitely apply some of that language to it, and if I were doing it today, I would do it a little bit differently. But on a day-to-day basis, when we were going over vocabulary, what I would do, and what I would probably do more if I were doing this over again, would be to say, do you remember our last adventure when we accomplished this? Well, let's prepare for the next adventure. This is what we want to accomplish next in the adventure that we're having. And so these are the tools that we're going to need in order to talk to such and such a person and keep on going with this adventure that we're having. So really trying to situate it in this world that we were constructing together, and just trying to connect it to something bigger and something that felt more like a game, instead of saying, this is the vocabulary we're going to learn today. It was more, these are the tools that we need to get through the next level, if I wanted to use that language, to fight the next boss, if I had wanted to use that language. This is the stuff that we're going to need in order to make our way through that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I would just add that some other elements maybe that could be incorporated into a classroom environment would be the idea of quests. So Spencer kind of touched on this with the idea of adventures, but also allowing students to have specializations. So something they can focus on in terms of their own learning and maybe a passion that they have. Also the idea of guilds or teams. to promote collaboration. Badges, I think, has already been mentioned. That's a big one. The idea of leveling up when you've kind of accomplished something big. And again, these are things that can be embedded. I think a lot of those elements would be from the role-playing genre. And those are things that there are digital sort of learning management and classroom management applications that you can use to do that. But I know many instructors and teachers that just use that in a non-digital way and kind of incorporate that language, like Spencer was saying. Just incorporating the language can kind of build some of that sense of adventure and of questing into the course.
Well, so much of that plays with what the students are doing in their free time at home when they are playing games and playing video games. This is all language that they understand, and it's something that is kind of an intrinsic value to them. They get excited about the idea of leveling up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So to give so there's little elements of gamification or gamifying the entire course, the entire semester. And I want to give a personal tiny example. When I first taught my very first online course in 1997, it was hard to get some students engaged in communicating and in doing the chat kinds of things. And so I had an artist create an animated dinosaur with 3 different states. One, it was crying giant dinosaur tears. One, it was dancing up and down. One was just sort of sitting there. And I automated it so that when they logged into the course page, depending on how much they had participated, it was either dancing or crying or still. And there's a sense of fun as opposed to just, you're not doing it enough. But I had to stop after that first year because the crying dinosaur was just too upsetting. I would get students emailing me saying, like, it's still crying, but I sent it in a minute ago. It's like, okay. So just little elements can add that sense of fun, and it was clearly there to motivate in a gentle way, right? Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, another example from one of the many great MAET students who I've had the pleasure of teaching in the Serious Game program, Luke Zaccaro, was teaching a podcasting class. And so his main goal was teaching how to do podcasting and that. But from the get-go, he had them be company, right? And they were competing for viewership as if they were radio stations or something like that, and tracking viewership, and there was virtual money that they were earning from all that kind of stuff and spreadsheets. And so it really drove promoting their stuff and getting everybody else in the class to look at it, and ratings and reviews and stuff like that. And so it oriented and motivated a lot of the behavior, and it had some parallels to real-world podcasting competing for eyeball time.
And as a novice, this entire idea, to me it seems that if you can add this aspect of play into your classroom, it's going to take the edge off of the idea of school being boring and school being a task and school being something that you have to do to being something that maybe you would enjoy being a part of. Right,
and ideally it kind of maybe pushes back against the idea of failure is an inherently bad thing to avoid, because in games, you're continually trying and failing until you kind of find the right approach. So that would be kind of maybe something that gamification in the classroom would be striving for.
Right. And just sort of to build on this idea, Erin, so Liz and I are actually working. We've been putting the final touches on the study for a while now, but we looked at educational games from a particular website and looked at what made certain games more enjoyable than other games, what made better games than other games. And one of the things that really stuck out to us, one of the interesting features that seemed to have some sort of effect on how enjoyable a game was if it was based on some other media property, so a game based off of a movie, game based off of a TV show or something like that. But surprisingly, those games were actually rated lower than other games. And this might be surprising at first, but to many people who play games, this isn't terribly surprising, because it's often a case of people slapping something that's supposed to be fun onto a game that underneath really isn't that good. And I think there's a lesson here, actually, for bringing gamification into the classroom. And that's Erin, you mentioned the importance of making school fun and the importance of making learning fun, and we need to understand that just slapping on some stuff that's supposed to be fun isn't actually, probably won't do the job all by itself, but we need to make sure that what's going on underneath, the actual learning, the things like that, that we're teaching our students to value those things, and that the activities, whether or not we're gamifying them or not, are engaging enough in a way that students can enjoy them, whatever sort of surface layer we're putting on top there.
I'm wondering if I have a connection here. So I started participating in Hour of Code with my students this past year, and for Hour of Code, they usually tie it in somehow to some kind of popular movie or TV show or something. There was a year where they did Angry Birds, and you know, the idea is to get kids excited about coding with an overlay of something that they understand. 2 years ago, they used Frozen as the Hour of Code project, and in it you had to take the characters from Frozen and have them ice skate into geometric figures. And part of the problem is that Frozen is really intended for younger audiences, but in order to be successful in the coding, you had to have some really high-level thinking skills to figure out the math involved, and so it wasn't as successful as it could have been because there was not that match. Is that right?
I think so. I mean, this is the impression that I get from what I've read in my own experience, but that the underlying stuff has to be engaging, not just at a surface level. And I think what you're talking about is a good example of that. If you know, you could slap Frozen onto astrophysics, and second graders still aren't going to get it. And you could give points and badges and all of these different game features to a learning activity that really isn't engaging for students at all, and it's still not going to be fun. So it's important that we think about both the surface level, but then especially what's going on underneath, the deep level underneath.
Right, and not just the level of engagement, but you know, is it pedagogically sound?
Yes,
you know, I mean, is it that just kind of a lot of design considerations, and I think I completely agree, and I saw where Spencer was going with that, with the connection that you know, if you just slapping something on, whether it's Frozen as a theme or gamification elements on top of a course that really maybe isn't the best course, it's not a quick fix. So.
And there's something really interesting there. Sorry, I'm going to not talk about this so much, but I think there's something interesting there in that gamification well done is almost self-defeating, because if you're paying attention to that underlying layer, then you're going to make the learning pedagogically sound, and you're going to make it engaging in a way that you almost don't need the game elements anymore, right? Because learning can be fun. We all know this, and this is why we're all involved in education. Not all of our students know it, but we can make learning fun by making the activities engaging to the point that we almost don't need gamification anymore. So it's a weird sort of self-undermining sort of thing.
Any other comments on that question before we go on?
Well, I think, you know, that we look at badges and points and the window dressing, but another aspect of since I teach about serious games is meaningfulness. And so I could argue that when I'm trying to urge my students to come up with projects that relate to their real life and that they might actually use in the real world as they're making it for something real, that adding meaningfulness in a weird way could be said to be a way of engaging and motivating behavior, right? And so that's not what we traditionally think of gamification. We think of coupons and airline points, but really meaningfulness is a serious gamification addition.
Carrie, would you say that all educational games are serious games?
No, well, some people say all games are serious games, and yeah, that's a complicated question, strangely enough. But certainly serious games include way more than just educational games.
Absolutely. Going on to our next question, we've already kind of touched on this a little bit, but how do you see your students benefiting from learning in a gamified environment? We talked a little bit about taking the pressure off. What might be some other benefits to adding gamification?
Well, I would just say maybe and again, we touched on this a little bit, but just adding a sense of playfulness to learning. What Carrie mentioned about meaningful, adding meaningful qualities. I mean, I know we all would like to think that everything we're teaching is very meaningful, but making that connection with their outside lives and their future plans, but also just allowing for playfulness, which unfortunately seems to be lacking in a lot of classrooms. So adding that back in, because I don't think that's necessarily a new idea, with gameful elements is ideally something that would be of benefit to students.
My mother spends a lot of time preparing the table setting for family get-togethers. What's in the centerpiece and the layout and exactly having everything just right. And she feels that affects the entire experience, the taste of the food, the company, and everything like that. And so, in a sense, you can look at gamification as sort of setting the stage and contributing to the feeling of the experience of learning, and as opposed to throwing a paper plate out on the table for the class. It's all about just it's like let's it's affecting the tone, the feeling of the space, the attitudes.
And I actually think the power of games certainly it's certainly related to the fun, but I think the power of rules in a games are really good at making us follow rules because we want to do well, and so we almost don't question the rules anymore. And in a lot of games, these are just arbitrary. But I think when gamification is done well, whether in the sense of making your classroom feel like a game or actually more in the sense of what Liz studies, bringing a game into the classroom and having the students play and learn through that, I think we can almost internalize the rules of the game, and if those rules correspond with the content area that we're thinking about, so if we learn that certain kinds of behavior in the game Civilization, for example, are more likely to help you win, and then if we can take that and draw lessons about history or about politics or about society from that, I think there's something that's very, very powerful there, in that in playing games, students and teachers can sort of internalize rules that hopefully match up with the rules of how our content area works, because each content area follows certain rules. In math, they may be a little more straightforward than they are in French, but in French, there are still certain rules that you have to follow if you want to make your meaning clear to someone. And if there's a gamified element in a French classroom that is going to reward players in a meaningful way for following those rules, then I think they're going to that will help them understand what those rules are, why they're important, and help them sort of get into a French mindset or into a history mindset or into a math mindset.
And that's very, very important, excuse me. The three of you have very different backgrounds in terms of your area of research in terms of gamification, and so I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the possibilities of where this could go on a higher level outside of the classroom for those who are watching today that might be interested in taking on some more gamification and some of the things that we could do. So if I could just have you talk a little bit about your particular area of research and what it is that you are looking at, that would be great. Is there anybody who wants to start with that?
Well, I can jump in since this isn't mine. Then we'll move back to the maybe the primary focus. But so my one of my recent research projects investigated how 8th graders demonstrated historical empathy while playing a historical video game called Valiant Hearts, which is about World War I. And I kind of conceptualized this through an existing framework that looks at historical empathy as a multidimensional construct that involves 3 different things, if you're kind of like a Venn diagram person: historical contextualization, perspective taking, and affective connection. So while looking at this, I had a group of 8th graders who played the game, and I just observed them and conducted some semi-structured interview protocol and did a pre and post test, and I found that, and this really is kind of a common sense result, but that's always that always kind of feels good. That yes, common sense, victory. I found that background knowledge really matters in at least in my study, the student's ability to demonstrate historical empathy. So, in other words, students who had more background knowledge in this area tended to be able to demonstrate more and more complex historical empathy while playing the game. And then I also looked at whether different types of gameplay in this game, it's kind of unusual in that it has quite a few different gameplay types embedded within it. But I looked at whether those gameplay types tended to seem to promote different dimensions of historical empathy more than others. And at least in the context of my study, I found that the historical facts that were embedded in the game, it has a mini game within it that involves collecting little historical artifacts, and each of those is accompanied by facts that have been researched by historians. And I found that finding those in the game tended to promote evidence of historical contextualization, which kind of makes sense since historical contextualization is kind of the knowledge of that time period and what was going on. And then I also found that cutscenes, so those mini movies that are tend to be strong narrative elements within a game, tended to promote effective connection, meaning that it made maybe stronger emotional connections between the player and the characters in the game, which also kind of intuitively makes some sense. So there were a lot of other findings, but those were kind of some interesting ones I thought I'd mention here, because I think to go back to a point that Spencer made earlier, it's really important that regardless of what we're trying to do, or whether we're gamifying or using games in a classroom or in an informal setting, that we look at what our goals are and make sure that we make appropriate choices in terms of what games we're using or what elements we're adding in, to make sure that we're aligning with what those goals are.
So that we're always thinking of TPAC.
Exactly.
Right through her.
Brownie points.
All right, so Spencer, do you want to talk about your research a little bit?
I would love to. So let me preface this with something. I'm really interested in decision making in games. So I was talking earlier about the power of rules and how if those rules match up with the rules of what we're trying to teach, then there can be something really valuable there. But sometimes we see rules as rules of a game and not rules of the real world. So, for example, once I was playing a board game with my brother-in-law. It was a little board game, pretty simple, but we got to an interesting point in the game where the smartest move for my brother to do was to drop a bomb on his own city to get rid of a tank that I had moved into that city. And that really blew my mind, because I was thinking, he's attacking his own city. This doesn't make any sense. He's playing the game as a game. He's not playing it as a real world, as a simulation of the real world. And that made sense because we were just two guys playing a game together. But if we were in a classroom doing that, then we'd have a real problem there, because someone's playing to win in a way that winning doesn't make sense in the real world anymore. So I'm interested in this relationship. When do people play games to win, and when do they play it when do they make a decision because that's what they would do in the real world? And I've actually built off of some of Carrie's work for this. So let me share my screen really quickly. Carrie has come up with a really helpful framework for thinking about how games are designed, that she calls, and we all call, the Ouroboros magic circle of serious game design. And this points out different elements of a game. And so about a year or two ago, I spent some time playing an ethics game with students in a class that I was teaching. And I was interested to see, when did students in that class make decisions to, quote, win in the game, and when did they see it as an opportunity to practice real-world thinking? And what I discovered is that all of these different elements of a game sort of need to be present. So the environmental constraints, what's represented in the game, that's something like the city in the war game that my brother-in-law and I were playing. It's there, but by itself, it's not going to convince someone to treat this as a real-world activity. What you also need is some formal constraints, so some rules that are going to govern your activity. Then there need to be some goals involved. And then the gaming context also needs to promote thinking about a game as a sort of simulation. So to sort of sum this all up, what I'm interested in and what I've found is that certain elements of a game need to be present in order for students to be thinking about it in real-world terms. And so that has a lot of implications for us as teachers and also as researchers, because if we want to use games in the classroom, we need to make sure that that context is there. We need to make sure that the game represents things, not only just on a surface level, but also in certain rules. We need to make sure that there are goals embedded in the game. And I'm just giving a very brief overview of what I've found. But essentially, there are going to be situations in which players are motivated to play the game for the game's sake, and when they're motivated to play the game as a way of practicing what they've been learned and applying it to a simulated real-world situation.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Carrie, talk about your research a little bit.
Sure. I just want to say that I love Liz's and Spencer's research. And I think it's such fascinating examples of really interesting ways to think about and study games. And so you guys are doing such great work. So I'm a little bit weird at this point. So I've been delving into designing and studying cyber meditation, which is just meditation experiences that you have inside of your mind, as opposed to video experiences and things like that. And so the reason that this relates at all to what we're talking about today is, like games and like classrooms, if you're studying education, right, it's this big long-term experience. And a lot of the effects of meditation happen after you've been doing it every day for a couple of years, right? There's overtime effects from long exposure and repeated experiences. There's single time, like looking at the effect of a single lecture or a single gameplay, as opposed to playing a game a lot of the times. And then there's sort of gamification, which is just little pieces of it. Mm-hmm. And so I actually wrote the word a couple of days ago in an essay I'm starting to write, meditatification. Right? It's taking some of the elements of the experience of meditating and saying, how can I apply this to my classes? How can I bring it into the design, actually, of virtual reality experiences, what we know from the wisdom of meditation design in terms of other elements. And so that's something I'm going to think about.
I can see a direct tie-in in K-12 education with that, I think, in that schools are trying to bring a little more mindfulness into their teaching day to help students deal with the stress of standardized testing and the demands that are put on them in school, where they don't have a lot of time to just sit and process. Is that a possible application of what you're looking at?
So that's a really great example. Right, and what they're doing is they're having a period of actual, in that case, mindfulness or meditation practice in the middle of the school day that helps help calm the mind and focus and prepare you for learning experiences. You're actually going to learn much better when you're in that kind of a state. And I'm thinking about, can I come up with a 2-minute optional meditation before class begins that brings us to the same page? One thing I have been doing for a number of years is, when people show up as we're filling in and getting ready to start class, I have a page that's titled Sparkles of Joy. With each person has a row, and they come in and we start the class, and they type in the times they've experienced joy throughout the week. And that fits because we're studying games, right? And it's a way of appreciating it, bringing it, foregrounding joyful thoughts and experiences, and then we start the class. It's like, yeah, so we're talking about little things. We're back to sort of the way the table is laid out before we do the dinner or something like that. But that affects the entire experience. Our emotional and mental state affects our ability and readiness to learn and our whole attitude. So yeah, that's a great example.
When you're ready to roll that out, let me know. I've got 500 kids here that could use it. We had a question come up on Twitter. The question came from Dana, and she was wondering, are there subject matters that lend themselves better to gamification, or types of content that can't be gamified?
Well, that would be an interesting contest. Can you stump the gamification? Because sometimes it can be surprising what gets gamified. And as a creative designer, I would like to. I could come up with a great way to gamify anything, but maybe not. But let me an example from another student in a former year, another MAET student. She had a terrible time. Her students were just not interested in learning Excel, but she was supposed to be teaching how to do spreadsheets. And so one of her class projects was she came up with the idea of a live relay game based on Excel. And so there was a series of tasks to come up with an eventual calculation at the end. She divided the class into 2 teams. They were lined up in a row, and they would run up, find out what they were supposed to do, and they would have to quickly enter it in, that step, announce what they've done, and run back. And so it was this race, and this motivated them to learn it in advance so they could be really quick in the relay game. In other words, what she motivated them to do was spend the time learning what they were going to do. And I would have thought that gamifying learning how to do Excel might have been hard, but she did well with that. Dana, maybe you want to see if you can stump Liz or Spencer with something to gamify. We can gamify a webinar.
Oh wow!
I was actually thinking that what if we're awarded points for each good contribution we make and
right
deducted for bad contributions.
Dana gets 5 points for a very interesting question too. So, Patrick, you have an added role now. You're not just picking up the camera; you're keeping track of points.
Is there a boss battle at the end of this webinar? That's what I want to know.
-10 for added challenge. Okay.
So anybody else have anything that they want to say regarding Dana's question for subject matter and things that can't be gamified?
So I think Carrie's hitting on something here where I'm not sure if subject matter is the right way to put it, because I think the success of the gamification and the example that Carrie gave, it was related to Excel, but it's a format that you could take and you could apply into other situations with a little bit of tweaking. And so that wasn't necessarily an Excel gamification. And I think in all, whatever subject matter we teach, whatever subject matter we're interested in, there are different things that we teach within that. There are certain kind of behavior. Liz was talking earlier about habits of mind. I was talking about attitudes and about rules. And I think these are the things that we want to think about, because what a game appears to be about might actually be teaching something different. And I think there are ways that games are better used than others. So I think it would be pretty easy to gamify a flashcard program where you're memorizing dates for your history exam. That would be pretty easy to do, but I don't think it's the best way to use gamification in a history classroom. So I'm not quite giving a straight answer here, so Patrick's probably going to take points off of that. Mm-hmm. But I think that there are other ways that we can think about, that we can get to what Dana is talking about, and I'd agree with Carrie. I think someone who's creative, in other words, someone who's not me, could probably come up with a good answer for just about anything. But it's more a question, it's less a question of what it's about and more a question of what we want our students to do. Do we want to introduce some competition so that they think about an Excel spreadsheet really quickly, and that they have to, on their own, they're memorizing things so that they can be prepared to do it on the spot? Or, what do we want our students to be doing rather than what are we talking about, if that makes sense?
Absolutely. Okay.
And I wonder, we might get at what might be reasons why you think a subject matter might not lend itself to gamification. Is it something that's so serious or horrible and important that we don't want to be profane and gamify it? And actually, in the serious game realm, that's actually that barrier has been crossed, right? So people have made games about horrible aspects of the world, child slavery, Darfur is dying, things like that, and that's sort of shown that no, there aren't really topics that can't be touched. It can be touched with respect and that kind of thing. So it can be, or can it not be gamified because it's just too boring and nothing could possibly help, or because it's too complicated? I mean, so if we unpack that question, we could look at the different possible reasons why one might think it might not work, and then there's an answer maybe of why it might work.
Mm-hmm.
If I can gamify the Dewey Decimal System and teaching that to students, I think anybody can gamify anything. All right, changing directions a little bit. Because of the demands on teachers and content and the things that they have to teach, we have to look at the ramifications to gamification and some drawbacks to trying to put this kind of an overlay into your classroom. So what are the ramifications of gamification, in your opinion?
That was a nice little rhyme scheme there. Ramifications of gamification. I would just kind of go back to something that I think we've said a couple times, which is there's a difference. It's important to clarify that there's gamification done well and gamification done poorly, right? Just like any tool in an educator's toolbox, a lot of it is how it's implemented and how well thought out it is. So I don't think necessarily that there are dire consequences for gamification as an entity. A lot of it stems from how is this done. So, but in a kind of a general sense, I would say, and please, Spencer and Carrie, jump in if you disagree, but I think maybe some of the discomfort that some people feel with the idea of gamification might be, and I'm talking kind of more specifically towards education, would be that a lot of the aspects that tend to be implemented in classrooms tend to come from ideas that are rooted in behaviorism, rewards and punishments. And since that, as a theory, as an educational theory, is a bit outdated, certainly can be effective in certain aspects of education, but there might be some concerns about, like, is this really intrinsic motivation? Or are we just kind of dangling carrots and using sticks? And I think that might be some of the concern. Again, gamification done well doesn't necessarily have to have those concerns that accompany it, but that would just be kind of one thing that I would point out.
And then I think, an obvious follow-up to that is if gamification needs to be the right kind of gamification to be good in the classroom, that's probably going to take more work. So I think it's important for teachers to realize this is going to take some tinkering. I've been interested in the idea of games and learning for a long time. But the first time that I've applied it in a couple of different circumstances, it did not turn out the way that I wanted it to. And I talked about the French class that I tried to gamify. There are so many things that I would do differently if I were back in K-12 teaching French 1 again, trying to do that again. So it's going to take some time. It's going to take some iteration. It's just like any other part of teaching. It's going to take some experimentation, and it's something that should always be, it's never too holy to be tinkered with. Always be willing to think about your goals, to think about where you are so far, and to keep pushing it towards where you want to be and what you're trying to accomplish.
So I think the traditional worry is, oh, that's going to take classroom time away from what they're supposed to be learning. But I think that what mostly happens is that it takes a lot of teacher time. And it's so easy to get carried away, right? Because this is so interesting. You've created this monster and you need to keep it coherent because it's happening. And so it gets better. The first time you're gamifying, it's going to take a lot more of your time, but as the system gets in place, then it starts running pretty smoothly and it keeps working. These are what I hear from former students who have been doing it and who have been trying it. There's one example of a former student, Melanik Tafari, who turned the entire curriculum into a live-action role-play game, and he was teaching Spanish and Aztec culture. And so throughout the entire semester, every student was an Aztec, member of an Aztec community, and the entire role-play had to be done in Spanish. And it was absolutely elaborate. He was at a charter school, so he wasn't constrained by the normal curricular constraints. But even so, he got halfway through the semester, and his principal came and asked him to stop teaching that way. And he said, well, I really can't stop in the middle of the semester, but tell you what, let's have a vote of the students if they want to go back to the regular way or not. So he got to continue. You can get extreme. You can get, and this can be controversial. It can be subtle. It can be fun. It's certainly enlivening, right? Lots of challenges.
Is it fair to say that adding gamification to your classroom may not be something that a brand new teacher wants to try to dive right into day one, that you really need to get your feet under you first before you can start thinking in this level about your own pedagogy?
I would not say don't touch it. I would say don't try to do the entire semester huge thing. Do
Right.
a little thing like a laughing dinosaur first, right? Play with it a little bit. It's game design is an iterative process. There's always something you do better. Teaching as well. So expect it to be iterative. Take a small bite first. That's my advice.
One of the things that I was thinking about as an elementary school teacher, something that I have to deal with a lot, is parent reaction to things that I do in my classroom, and a concern that I have regarding gamification. I was actually thinking about with one of Spencer's earlier examples with the Excel spreadsheet, and we have this whole idea of the everybody wins mentality, and have the idea that if I were to do something like that, I might get some pushback from parents about kind of calling their student out on something that they didn't learn. Do you really think that that's an issue, or am I kind of overthinking it?
I think it's certainly an issue, but I think it's one that can be overcome. So Liz spoke early in the webinar about the power of games to help us embrace failure in a new way. And I think there is something powerful to that, that there are a lot of people who don't mind failing in a game over and over and over again, because at the end of the day, they just want to get to where it's right. So I think this is almost, this isn't an issue so much with gamification so much as it is with classroom culture. And that's a bit unfair because we don't have total control over our classroom culture. But I think it's an issue of making it so that when we're telling our students that they didn't get something quite right, that's not a value judgment on them. And that's something that gamification can help with, because maybe, depending on the kind of game, maybe you can turn around and you can try it again, and you're going to do better next time. Or it's, it's just going to be part of the situation that some people succeed and other people fail, but because of the fun of the game or because of the culture that we've built, that's something that's going to be okay. So it's a question that goes beyond gamification. It's one that I don't have specific answers for, but I think I think there are ways to get around it. So yes, an issue. No, I don't know all the answers, but I'm optimistic that this is something that can be overcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not necessarily like, yay, failure is fantastic, but it's the difference between being a failure and just failing.
Right.
That it's okay to fail if you keep trying, and kind of trying to embed that kind of mentality from games into your course, instead of, which unfortunately sometimes happens, where students have experience a failure and then internalize that I am a failure. I'm not even going to try that again because I don't want to experience that feeling again.
That's not necessarily different than how your parents react if you give a grade, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gamification isn't really changing that. It's a form of evaluation.
Right.
So gamification can be tricky. As in games, you don't want to set up a structure where it's sort of cumulative, and so there's a clear leader by week 2, and there's no way anybody can catch up, so it becomes unmotivating, right? And so you want to reset so that it's everybody's got an equal chance regularly throughout. And you also want to avoid intrinsic or extrinsic motivation replacing intrinsic, right? Because we want intrinsic learning is sort of a much higher value. So we don't want to mess up the intrinsic learning by putting in lots of extrinsic rewards. The study of when children were paid to draw pictures, they stopped drawing after they stopped getting paid, whereas they used to love to. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of, I think there's a phrase by James Paul G, pleasantly frustrating, and I really like that, because that describes a good game, and I think that kind of describes good learning. If you're just coasting along, whether it's in school, a course, or in a game, it's sort of, you lose that aspect of challenge. But you don't want something to be so overwhelmingly challenging that you give up. So it's just that idea of something that's pleasantly frustrating. And maybe that's something that good gamification is trying to accomplish.
And I think, so I've been thinking about this more since I stopped talking the last time. But if we're using games to sort of create a context for our learning, you know, a parent might get upset if we give a student a poor grade on a French quiz. But if we tell the parent, look, your son or your daughter doesn't know how to get past border control in this adventure that we're doing, and that's because they don't know the vocabulary very well, and I'm trying to teach them so that they could get past border control and show their passport and do that sort of thing, then I think on one hand, it shows we don't want to punish the student. We're just trying to help them get to a point where they aren't yet. And that's not going to say that we're going to abandon them. And again, this goes beyond gamification to other classroom culture, to other practices that we do as teachers. But we're not going to abandon them. We want them to get to a certain point. Our gamification shows, and it sort of gives some meaningfulness, to use Carrie's phrase, to give some meaning to that point that we're trying to get them to, because it's something that's valuable in a context if we're doing gamification right. This adventure has meaning in the world outside of my classroom. To be able to talk to someone at the grocery store, that's more meaningful than just passing a quiz. And so we can talk to a parent and we can say, your child just isn't at that point yet. I want to help them get there, but in this adventure that we did, they just weren't able to do it. That doesn't mean that your child is bad. It just meant that I need to work with them more, that we're going to find a way to get there to succeed. But it almost justifies the decisions we make in a certain way, that to win in an adventure is different than winning on a quiz, because winning on a quiz is a matter of points, and everyone gets upset about points. Winning an adventure, there's some logic there. There's some logic there that reinforces what we're trying to teach, how we're trying to teach it. And I think it might actually help us communicate to parents if we're thinking about gamification in those terms, because again, there's a lot of different ways of thinking about gamification. But if we're thinking about gamification in those terms, it can almost help us justify the decisions that we make and reframe winning and losing in a way that helps us understand why we want students to win at certain things and helps us lead them towards winning in those areas.
I don't want to put an end to this particular discussion, but we are ending the hour, and we have one question that I really want us to get to before we leave today. If a teacher wanted to get started gamifying their classrooms, can you provide a resource, something that they should go out and seek out, a good website or a good article that could give them a place to get started?
Well, I'll just offer up a little, just 2 cents. I think in one sense it depends on what they're interested in doing. I really like Carrie's advice that it might be good if you're getting started to start small and work on something and kind of keep iterating it to make sure you kind of get it right before you tackle a huge task. But so if someone is interested in badging, they might be looking into certain resources, or if they're kind of more advanced and ready to use some gameful course management, they look at something else. So in terms of badging, and I haven't used these, but ones that I've heard of, and Spencer may have more input on this, would be openbadges.org or classbadges.com. And there's probably other resources out there. Those are just 2 that I'm familiar with. And then in terms of gameful course management, there's a site called classcraft.com, which is sort of modeled after Warcraft, and I played with that a little this week. It was fun to play with. I haven't actually used it for course management. Another one that's being developed, it's in development right now, but maybe to kind of keep an eye out if it's something that you're looking for on the horizon. I think the University of Michigan, our friends down the road, are developing a course management, gamification course management system called Gradecraft. And that would be, so those are classcraft.com and gradecraft.com.
And of course, you could take MI830, Foundations of Serious Games, where you're learning about
highly recommended
how to design games and gamification, and that would give you a strong foundation.
Better than any website.
Yeah. So there's a book that I'd like to recommend. So it speaks to this sort of this broader, this slightly different take that I've been talking about of gamification, of immersing someone in an adventure, and it's called World Peace and Other Fourth Grade Achievements by a man named John Hunter, who has no background in game design, but he woke up one day and decided that in order to get his students to understand a certain thing, he needed to make up a game. And with no experience in this area at all, he's done something that when you read about it in this book or when you watch the documentary that's associated with it, it just gets me so excited about the power of games. So this is a different kind of gamification. It's probably not a first step, but if you want to feel just how powerful this can be, and if you really want to get excited about it, then I think that's a fantastic book to read.
Awesome, thank you. Well, we are going to be wrapping up for today. So first I want to thank our experts for coming in and talking with us today. So thank you, Carrie and Liz and Spencer, for stopping by this afternoon. And thank you to everybody who tuned in today and for your thoughtful questions over on Twitter. This webinar is going to be archived on the MAET website. You can find it at http://bridge.educ.msu.edu, and it will be there for your viewing pleasure. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to send them to us on Twitter using the hashtag MAETBridge. I'm Erin Dennis. Thanks for visiting with us today, and I also want to say thank you to the help of Lori Fernandez, Nicole Mifsud, and Patrick Greeley for all of their technical support today. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Great
you.
job. Thank you for having us. Thank you.